And this is one of the continuing series of interviews provided by the Friends of Multilateralism. My name is Hamid Mamdouh. I'm a member of the group and a longtime practitioner of international trade. And I have the utmost pleasure today of having this interview with Dr. Sherry Stephenson. And I think we were sort of discussing this before the session, and we thought we would make it a bit of a mutual interview. So we hope that this will be an interactive conversation, which would be as useful as we can possibly make it for you. Now, just a couple of words about Sherry, who is a longtime, very dear friend. She is a very well-respected international trade practitioner, thinker. She had many contributions. She is now affiliated to the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. She's a long-time professional, worked way back during the GATT times and the WTO, and she has taken on tremendous number of consultancy assignments. She's a very well known name for those of you who are familiar with the international trade circles. So starting off, I would want to ask you, Sherry, about your thoughts regarding the outcome of MC12, because the series of interviews that we're doing with the FMG are about the outcome of MC12 and what do we think about those outcomes with respect to individual subject matters. And today we're going to talk about services, trade and services. And that's why I start this conversation with you, Sherry, by asking you, what are your thoughts about the services-related outcomes of MC12?
Thank you so much, Hamid. And on my side too, it's absolutely a great pleasure to be here with you. I can't think of anyone else I'd rather discuss services with and who has more knowledge on the issue. So it's actually really humbling for me to be the one being asked about it, because I really think the shoe should be on the other foot. But we will definitely have an interaction in our thoughts. And if you want me to go first, then definitely please. I can do that. And I guess I would start out by saying that MC12 had some positive outcomes. It perhaps didn't go as far in some areas as one would have wanted, but certainly in terms of services are on the table, and they were on the table in MC12, and they do appear officially in 4 different places. Once in the general outcome document, and 3 in different ministerial, twice in the outcome document, and 2 times in ministerial decisions. So just maybe I could take us through those 4 different outcomes, and we can comment on them along the way. And I think the good place to start would be with the general outcome document from MC12. And this was great because there is a paragraph in the outcome document that is a paragraph dedicated exclusively to services, and it recognizes, really kind of for the first time in the trade world, the importance of services, trade to the global economy, and its major role in output and employment. And that's highly significant and a good step forward for us, realizing that services are by far the main sector of economic activity in all developed economies, and also already in many developing economies, and in most WTO members in terms of output and employment. And what is often less realized is that services now represent also over half of world trade flows when measured in value-added terms. So that's not necessarily well appreciated, but that is when we look at their contribution, not just to the balance of payment statistics in final services trade, but as inputs to all other traded goods and services. So they're incredibly significant to the world economy, and the outcome document recognizes this. And it has language in it that says, we underscore the importance of recovery for services most impacted by the pandemic and of efforts to strengthen such services, taking into account challenges and opportunities encountered by members. And this is an interesting paragraph. I think we can discuss this later, and it will lead us into services agenda post MC12 context. How can we strengthen services in the future? How can we take into account challenges and opportunities? The paragraphs leaves this open, and therefore it is up to the members to decide. And I think we can maybe devote a bit of our discussion to this later on. And the second point, place in the outcome document that mentions services, is paragraph 8 on the preferential treatment in favor of LDCs. And we know that there is an LDC services waiver that has been in place for a number of years. And this paragraph gives a mandate to the WTO members to basically carry out a review of its effectiveness, because there is a question of how effective it has actually been in practice in terms of fostering the greater integration of LDCs in services trade, in global services trade. And so this reference to services is formally recognized there and will be carried out in the future. We can discuss this, I guess. In my mind, the LDC services waiver, it's good that it exists because it puts services and services importance on the table, but I think it would have been usefully complemented by a component of a regulatory review of services regimes and LDCs in the context of the Aid for Trade mandate and the Aid for Trade program. And that is not mentioned in the ministerial outcome document. So I think that, yes, it's good, but like I said at the outset, it could have gone farther, because the real significance of more efficient service sectors comes through regulatory reform. Without regulatory reform at home, you cannot really effectively participate better in global services trade. So, you know, they go hand in glove, and one is the generator of the outcome of the other. So I think that that component needs to be added in the future. The third place that services is mentioned in the ministerial outcome is as part of the pandemic response. In the ministerial declaration on the WTO response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in paragraph 17, it is recognized that services play a critical role in ensuring resilience and in facilitating the trade in essential goods, therapeutics, medical supplies and equipment, etc. And the particularly key role of logistics and transport services are recognized, which I think is a very important thing. Logistics is playing an increasingly prominent role in our world of supply chain interconnectivity and resilience, and we need to recognize that, and we need to focus more on that. And I think that its recognition in this paragraph is useful. I would have thought that they might have put it together in the context of looking at the whole supply chain efficiency and resilience question, but that is not mentioned in the actual paragraph itself. But from my perspective, they go together and they need to be highlighted jointly. So I would say that, you know, again, it's positive, but it could have gone a little bit further. That's what I would say. And in the last place that services is mentioned, and certainly not last but least, is with the e-commerce moratorium extension. And that is part of the ministerial decision on the work program on electronic commerce. And that is in two parts. The first part of that ministerial decision is the renewal of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmission. And what that decision does is to continue the current practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions until MC13 or until the end of March 2024. And I think here we have three major takeaways, and I'd really be interested to have your outlook and your opinion on this as well. It's obviously a positive, very positive signal from the WTO members for the business community that the extension of the moratorium happened at MC12. The Global Services Coalition in particular was very heavily involved in actions and lobbying for the extension of the moratorium. And it would have been a very bad signal if the WTO had allowed its members to actually impose duties instead of trying to remove them. Whether or not this is actually feasible to do on services is a different question. But I think the other significant aspect is for the first time, the extension has an expiry date. And the expiry date is not that far in the future. And I think this will inject uncertainty around the issue as this date approaches. And so, you know, we are sort of in a situation where the issue has not gone away and it still will be there, but it gives time for the General Council to hold reviews and discussion on what the moratorium actually means, what it implies, and really what it covers in practice and what has been its impact, the scope, definition, and impact. So this might allow large developing services exporting countries like India to be able to carry out a better discussion of this domestically or others. But I think that the moratorium decision was a positive one because otherwise it would have been a very negative view for the WTO. And it will give time for a better understanding of exactly what is involved in this and what is its impact on trade. And so these are my takeaways from the actual inclusion of services in the formal instruments resulting from MC12. But then I think we can discuss more, you know, the implication of services for the other aspects of the WTO work, which perhaps were not included in the ministerial outcome and are missing. But I think that's another, we can have that conversation a little later. So I guess my view would be, and you think as well, the WTO, it was a positive outcome on services, but it could have gone further. Would that have been your impression as well? And in what ways?
Well, thank you, Sherry. You've given a full overview of all the services-related elements in the outcome. I think you've articulated in a very nice, digestible way, but also with a great deal of depth. My commentary on what you said actually is that the first point you mentioned, I think, is very significant, which is you're right. It was a positive sign that services is on the table and attracted some attention, but it wasn't to the extent that would fulfill the ambitions of the services industries and also services constituencies of members of the WTO. Honestly speaking, in other words, it's great that it came out, but it leaves a few things to be desired. This is why I like very much your reference to just picking later on in this conversation on what comes next, because what it means really is that what we have in the outcome of MC12 is what we make of it afterwards. So the discussion about the afterwards, I think, is going to be interesting. But one of the most important points I think that you made is that the importance of services as the biggest chunk of the world economy and the biggest generator of employment. And also I would add the services FDI flows are 2/3 of global FDI flows. And I'm not aware of any country who's not trying to attract foreign direct investment, which is the lifeblood for growth and job creation and prosperity and everything. But you're right, this is not well appreciated. And I think one of the biggest political points here to be made is that services trade and services trade policy needs more attention from policymakers in capitals. They need to pay more attention to services policies. And this is terribly important for LDCs as well. And I'm glad you referred to the LDC preferential treatment, as it is mentioned in paragraph 8 of the outcome document. This highlights, in my view, a very, very important reality regarding services trade and its importance for development of developing countries and LDCs. Because when people talk about trade, you immediately think of merchandise trade. I think we haven't, from the policy making and the political leadership perspective, we have not made this transition from the old concept of trade, i.e. containers and boxes crossing borders, to the new reality of trade, which is more than half of it is services trade. And therefore, the whole idea of liberalizing services trade and its role in the process of development of developing countries and LDCs is very different from the idea of liberalizing merchandise trade and how that helps the development of developing countries. In other words, the old notion of infant industry argument in manufacturing doesn't apply at all in services trade. Developing countries could not have achieved what they have achieved in a sector like telecommunications had they closed off their market and said, well, we're going to protect our domestic telecom authorities until they become competitive and then start opening. So that policy dynamic, I think, needs to be understood. And this is why I'm so happy that you refer to this, that it's not well appreciated. And I hope that this outcome of MC12 would provide some energy to bring more awareness and more attention of policymaking crowds. Now, of course, the pandemic has also faced us with new realities, as you very well know. It hit negatively in a very severe way some sectors, all sectors actually that rely on movement of natural persons, be it tourism or even healthcare, where it involved movement of persons. At the same time, it was very, very stimulating to everything that is digitally supplied. The process of digitalization that we expected to happen in 5 years happened in 6 months. And the pandemic brought about this increasing importance that almost changed a lot of the realities. And I think all this, in terms of new realities, will feed into what next.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How are we going to? Okay, now we have the tool. We have a license to talk. This is what we have in the outcome. So how are we going to use this license? One last word before I throw a couple of questions to you about the moratorium. This is also one of the things I'm happy that you mentioned. The moratorium on not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. I think it's a very good sign that it was extended. The question, and here, if I may venture a bit and take some liberties in talking about the moratorium is intended to address something that is so critically important, which is to preserve the smooth supply of electronically delivered services across borders. Now, not only across borders, but also, services are supplied through different modes, including, commercial establishments. But this is the intention of that moratorium. But the substance of the moratorium, I believe, needs to be addressed more squarely and in a more legally binding way through ongoing negotiations. Currently in the WTO, and in particular, the Joint Statement Initiative negotiations on e-commerce, where we're
going to get there.
Yeah, where exactly, you're right. Sorry, I might be getting a bit ahead of myself here.
You're getting ahead.
But I'm just raising a flag. So I'll throw that back to you, Sherry.
Okay.
And
good.
Give us your thoughts about, okay, what next?
Well, actually, the what next is really, really important, because I think the things that weren't said in the formal documents of the MC12 outcome are really, I don't want to say what really counts, because obviously the e-commerce moratorium counts a lot. And the recognition of the importance of services trade counts a lot, and the recognition of the essential role that services play in the COVID-19 response counts a lot. But there are huge things going on in WTO universe in the terms of joint initiatives that are not mentioned at all in the formal documents, and that we really need to be aware of. And that's the future. And that's, one is the now, and then the next is the future. And the now is that there is a completed agreement initiative, joint services initiative on services domestic regulation that is tremendously important, that was finalized in time for the MC12 had it been held last December. And this initiative is so incredibly significant for the services world and for trade in general, that it really deserves a lot of discussion, a lot of emphasis. It is not a formal part of the MC12 outcome document because it is a plurilateral initiative result, but extremely important that the outcome is going to be applied to all WTO members on a multilateral basis. So it is it is becoming, in the process of becoming, a part of the WTO, a legally binding part of the WTO, and applied on a multilateral basis. How? By incorporating the commitments, so the disciplines in this joint service initiative into the participating WTO member schedules. And the way that's done is through adding them, it's kind of technical, but they just are added into the additional commitments column. And once approved domestically, and then at the WTO level, they become binding. And this is the first major, actually the first agreement on services that has been reached since the WTO came into existence. So that's the first reason I think it's terribly significant. And that is since 1997 and the Protocol on Financial Services. So this is the first agreement in 25 years for the WTO. The second reason it's terribly significant is because of the coverage of services trade that it involves. It covers 92% of global services trade. The 70 participants in the domestic services regulation outcome cover or represent 92% of global services trade. So that means these disciplines, once binding in their schedules, will effectively be applied to 92% of global services trade. And the third reason I think it's terribly significant is that the services domestic regulation outcome will address those barriers that service providers themselves have indicated are the most burdensome and troublesome for them in their own ability to trade services across borders. And my organization, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the PECC, did a really interesting study in 2016 of the business community and asked them, what are the barriers that are the most bothersome to you? What really blocks your ability to do business in services and raises your costs? And they said on the top of the list, their reply was the lack of transparency, the multiple layers of bureaucracy, and the lack of predictability in administrative procedures and processes, particularly around licensing, etc. And at that time, the respondents and the survey, the PECC advocated the development of a set of regulatory principles across all sectors that would improve upon this situation. And the JSI and Services Domestic Regulation is the answer to this. And this is extraordinary because it doesn't always happen in the international world. And, only 5 years later. So I think it's quite extraordinary. This is the result of the demand from the business community. So the WTO has been responsive, and that's very important. It's very important the WTO does not become detached from the business community and the realities of what it really means in practice to trade services. And the last is that there is going to be a huge cost benefit, cost savings benefit from this JSI for not only the countries who apply this to their own services traders and consumers, but also to all the others they apply it to, although not to the same significant proportion. But I think what's really key here is there are no losers in this outcome. This JSI is a win-win outcome. And I mean, that's also amazing because you don't have that often in trade. Trade often has, we have winners, and the winners are, more numerous and more important than the losers, but you have to be able to compensate the loser. In this case, there are no losers because the JSI basically targets the elimination of inefficient administrative procedures, red tape, and bureaucracy. So it eliminates what we call deadweight costs. Yeah. And when you eliminate deadweight costs, there are no losers. So everyone is a winner. And so in estimating the potential services trade cost reductions that this JSI on domestic regulation might bring about, this has been done for 14 APEC economies and for the G20 countries. And these are estimated to average around 7%, significant, over 3 to 4 years in the cost of doing services trade. And the largest cost reductions would be in the area of computer services, insurance, telecommunications, and banking. All of these are infrastructure services for our global trade and our supply chains. And so the outcome of this initiative is unambiguously positive, significant, and I think makes the WTO very relevant to the business community. And particularly also, we shouldn't forget that its impact can even be felt more significantly often for small service suppliers, because they are the ones that disproportionately have to bear the costs of these administrative burdens and inefficiently. So this is really great. And I also think it's significant that the 3 most recent adherents to this initiative are the United Arab Emirates and Georgia and Timor-Leste. So, developing countries are interested in this outcome and they are paying attention. And I think this makes the WTO highly significant in this area. So I have something else to say on, electronic commerce and another component that wasn't covered at all in the outcome document, but maybe why don't you share with us your view if you are as positive on this as I am, or not?
Well, I'm happy you mentioned domestic regulation, in spite of the fact there was no mention of it in the outcome of MC12. But as you rightly said, it was intended to coincide with MC12. Yes. But when MC12 was postponed at the last minute, way back in November, the participants in the domestic regulation negotiations decided that they have concluded the negotiations and they wanted to declare that negotiation concluded and move forward to the next phase. And the next phase is part of the current situation now, which is to incorporate the outcome of those negotiations into the schedules of participants. As you rightly said, we don't want to get too technical, but they would add those commitments to their schedules of commitments through a process of certification that would give legal effect to the outcome. Now, this is an important part because it feeds into a lot of activities, as you rightly said. I mean, one of the most significant aspects of this is that facilitating services trade at this level of providing more transparency, more predictability in regulation, streamlining administrative procedures and streamlining the administrative burden would definitely be most meaningful to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and would go a long way in in serving those companies, which represent the biggest part of our economies today. I mean, if you think of SMEs and the biggest challenges that they're facing, I always think of two challenges that they always face: access to finance and the regulatory burden. And if you can do anything to smoothen the regulatory burden, you go a long way in empowering them. So you're right, there aren't losers here. So what is there not to like about
exactly? It's nice. It's nice to have a story like that. It's wonderful. So and a significant economic one with a significant economic impact.
So the important thing now is the institutional aspect of it in the WTO to, go through the certification and consolidate the new commitments, particularly since they're going to apply on an MFN basis, which means actually that participants would extend all those benefits to non-participants. So I would not see any grounds for any non-participant to object to the certification of those schedules on a substantive basis or even on a legal basis. So we hope that this would go through. And then, of course, this is not the kind of negotiation in which participants would be worried about critical mass or free rider risk or anything like that. As we know, all those regulatory reforms cannot be applied on a discriminatory basis. Correct. So these kind of outcomes, even if they're negotiated on a regional basis, they automatically get extended to everyone. So this is a good part of the process. Now, moving from domestic regulation to other things, what else is on your mind, Sherry?
Well, there are two other things that are on my mind that I think are incredibly important for the services agenda and the WTO and services trade in general for the future. And one of them is ongoing and one of them is not right now ongoing. And I think the other one is the JSI, the Joint Service Initiative on Electronic Commerce. And this one, again, is a plurilateral initiative begun in early 2018. Right now has a large number of participating WTO members, 86, that account for over 90% of global services trade. But it is complicated a little bit by the fact that it is in a parallel track with the work program on electronic commerce in the WTO. And the work program on electronic commerce in the WTO, which was launched a long time ago, 1998, does not have a negotiating function. So it's a non-negotiating activity. And it just carries out exploratory talks and tries to clarify issues around electronic commerce. So in light of the fact that it is not a rule-making activity, a group of WTO members thought it was very important to start a discussion which could lead to an update in the rules of the WTO, or at least the regulations and disciplines of the WTO around digital trade. And that is something that differentiates the JSI, the Joint Service Initiative on Electronic Commerce, from the work program on electronic commerce. It's an important distinction because the JSI hopes to produce a binding agreement amongst members on clear. JSI on e-commerce discusses both the traditional trade topics like trade facilitation and e-commerce, etc., but also digital policy issues. And that's really important because these are not discussed anywhere else in the WTO. Cross-border data flows, data localization, electronic signatures, online consumer protection and privacy, network neutrality. These are absolutely critical issues for our modern world, where it's estimated that right now, by the UNCTAD, 60% of all services trade is taking place in digitized form. That's huge, and it's going to continue increasing. So we are in a digitized universe. And another thing that you shared with me, Hamid, is that 90% of the Joint Service Initiative discussion on e-commerce is actually services. It's constituted by services. So the JSI on electronic commerce should really almost be called JSI on services in electronic commerce, because that's the heart and soul of it. And therefore, this is an incredibly significant undertaking as well. It has made progress, but it's not yet in any type of conclusion stage. If the issues involved in it are much more controversial than the ones that were involved in the ones on the domestic services regulation disciplines. So it will be a much more challenging area to conclude, but it is extremely important to conclude. It's being led by Australia, Japan, and Singapore jointly. And I think that this is another area that will be critical for future WTO work on services if it's going to be modernized and what they call made fit to purpose for the digital universe we now live in. Would this be your take as well? And do you want me to push on to the second one that I think is not being done at all, or do you want to comment on the first one?
Let me say a couple of things on this one, and then we move together to your last point. I think you started off with the distinction between the work program and the GSI, and this is a very, very useful distinction. It's useful because it highlights the different natures of the two processes. Mm-hmm. And even if I look at it from a WTO reform point of view, WTO reform, which I think is perhaps one of the most important outcomes of this MC12, I see the mandate on WTO reform here is like the lifeboat that should save the WTO and enable it to sail successfully into the future and become the WTO of the future, as I was called it. But I think they both represent two separate functions in the WTO. The work program was adopted way back in 98 to clarify how the rules of the WTO apply to electronic commerce. This is the first deliberative effort that is needed before you start any negotiation. And when it started off, it started off quite well, actually, at least on the services side. There was a report adopted by the Services Council, by the entire membership, something that sounds like a dream when you think of the current environment, that explains how the different articles of the GATS apply to electronic commerce. Now, this kind of conversation should have continued until we clarify more and then say, okay, how do we use the outcome of these deliberations as to start a well-informed negotiation? That logical systemic connection was broken. And that's why after so many years, countries, members who are interested in the subject, and they realize that the real world is advancing, not going to wait for us, they launched the Joint Statement Initiative to negotiate on the subject matter. So I like very much that distinction you made from the outcome, so that we don't confuse one with the other. Actually, looking at this experience highlights some of the elements of WTO reform that we need to look at in terms of the regular function and the negotiation. And then looking at the issues, I mean, you highlight some of the very important issues like cross-border data flows, localization requirements. There is a lot of issues which are of critical importance if we want digital trade to flourish. Now, to my view, there are two kinds of efforts that are needed here. One is to clarify some of the existing rules, because on those issues, there are rules. On cross-border data flows, for example, there is an explicit obligation in the telecommunications annex on cross-border data flows. If it needs clarification, let's clarify it. If its scope of application needs to be adjusted, let's do that. On localization requirements. Localization requirements are 99.9% inconsistent with national treatment. They inflict a competitive disadvantage. Okay, can we clarify that? And the other kind of effort is new rules. We need new rules on things that are not actually addressed, because the rules that we have now have been negotiated way back in the mid-90s. Now, here I want to introduce an element of precision. When we say new rules, we have to keep in mind, I think, that the WTO and any trade agreement, even regional agreements, are not standard setting mechanisms. So when we talk about, okay, what about privacy? What about online consumer protection? What about cybersecurity? Trade agreements don't set standards. They only say, in principle, you must have a law to protect privacy, but it doesn't tell you what to do. You know,
exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So we have to be very clear about what we burden a trade negotiation with. It's not to set standards. Actually, one of the most sophisticated and complex conversations we're going to have for many years to come is about this interface between trade liberalization and trying to facilitate cross-border and cross-jurisdictional trade, digital trade, that is. How does that interface with the rising tide of regulations, regulatory interventions, which are legitimate to protect privacy, cyber security, national security, all these things. And the objective of those efforts will always be how to ensure least trade restrictiveness, not to interfere with regulatory sovereignty. That's a very, very fine line to walk when it comes to digital trade. We've done that in the past with TBT and SBS. So the concept is not new, but its application carries with it, complications that we have not seen before. This is why it would be important to look at that challenge with an insightful mind and see, okay, what exactly would be the kind of new rules that we have? So these are the kind of things that I hope would be achieved through these negotiations. And as I mentioned in our previous conversation about the outcome, when you mentioned the moratorium, I think it would be good to look at what really is the substance that we want to achieve behind the moratorium, because the reality is there is no agreement in the WTO today about what it covers. Electronic transmissions, is it the carrier function alone, or is it also the content? So it would be good to clarify its coverage and look at the substantive obligations and consolidate them in a legally binding way through the e-commerce negotiations. So hopefully, I mean, these are my comments on this important element, but let's move on to your third point that was not covered.
Okay, thanks very much. That's superb that you added all of those. It's incredibly useful. And I think that your point about this could be usefully taken up in the context of the mandate that was given on the WTO reform agenda, as could be perhaps viewed as part of that discussion. I'm not sure, but certainly it has to be viewed as a part of the response to the business community's concerns. That's absolutely vital. So that the business community wants the WTO to be appropriately and adequately supplied in terms of its response to digital trade challenges is absolutely critical. We've seen some of the regional trade agreements moving a little ways in this direction, and the more they move, the further behind the WTO becomes, the less it loses credibility. So it has to be brought up fit to purpose for the digital world, and I think this electronic commerce discussion is the place that where it has to happen. So
absolutely.
that would
If I may clarify one point, Sherry, when I mentioned the refer to what you said about the work program versus the JSI. My thought with respect to WTO reform there was that this is a very good example of the interconnectedness between the different functions in the WTO.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yeah. Okay, good.
Go
all right, well, I guess the third area that I think that where the MC12 outcome document was silent and lacking, honestly lacking in the services universe and the services WTO context was in it did not mention the need to revitalize the services negotiating function of the WTO, to expand the existing commitments, and to look at the unfinished business in the services area that really lies in front of negotiators because of the inbuilt negotiating agenda that they had from 1995 onwards to expand the market access universe of services commitments. And this is under Article 19 of the GATS. It started in 2000. It started positively, but then it was unfortunately overtaken by the Doha round and the single undertaking obligation. And it became hostage to any progress in agriculture, and unfortunately never saw the light of day. So the services negotiations that had progressed tremendously were unfortunately never concluded. So those draft commitments, expanded commitments, are still just pieces of paper on the table. That means that currently the system is not responding and functioning as it should be. Services should be now looked at again in its own light. We don't have the Doha round negotiations anymore. We don't have that, straitjacket of the single undertaking. Services has a built-in mandate to update its expansion of its services commitments. And I think this is extremely important from a systemic perspective. It was not mentioned in MC12, but actual WTO members don't need it to be mentioned. They can do it, and they are mandated to do it on their own. Of course, it would have been nice to mention it, but they can do it. So, somehow we need to find a champion or a way, and not in the context of necessarily a JSI, but a way to have this impulsion on the table once again. And what needs to be done? Well, I think two things in particular. It would be great to review existing commitments and say, yes, well, a lot of these are out of date right now. Why don't we just bind our current regulatory regimes in those areas where we have commitments? And then that obviates even negotiations. So you save a lot of time, a lot of effort, and what you basically get is a removal of all of this gap, or what we call water, in the commitments between what is now the level of commitments and the actual regulatory practice. So, you could do that without even a negotiation. You could simply agree to do that, sector by sector, or across the board, or mode by mode. But mode one in particular was very neglected in 1995, cross-border trade, because the world was not digitized at that point. And now that services are traded, and traded in the majority in digital form, we need to expand the commitments on mode one. Now, this may be done through a negotiation or any other way that sector by sector that WTO members want to carry it forward. But it is really critical that these two processes take place, that we update the commitments somehow, either in an easier way or in a negotiating forum, and that we expand the commitments on our digital trade universe. So this would be my thought as to what was not in the emphasized and even discussed in MC12 outcome. And I guess my question to you, Hamid, is how do we get the WTO to start this process going again?
I think you gave the answer. They don't need a mandate.
No.
It's in Article 19. And even Article 19 itself calls for plurilaterals. Paragraph 4 says the negotiations may be advanced on a bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral. So get a critical mass and just do it. And the second is basically you need a champion, as you said it. Leadership. Leadership is key. And this brings us back to the point that we made in the very beginning. You made it, and I second you when you said that it's not well appreciated. And I said policymakers need to pay more attention to services trade because they need to. I think there is a lack of understanding within policymaking circles of how services trade would actually contribute tremendously to the overall levels of competitiveness of the entire economy. Services are inputs to everything. There isn't one country. When you look at merchandise trade, it is universally recognized there would be a mistake to restrict the import of intermediary products that go into manufacturing activities. Why? Because you're hurting your own industries. Yes. Well, services are exactly that. They're intermediary products. Now, the extent to which your economy enjoys efficient, up-to-date, state-of-the-art services, every productive activity in which those services would be inputs to would be more competitive. So what is there not to like about this? Just that there isn't enough attention to it. So a champion is needed. It's leadership. So there you go. Now the only thing that I would add also, because you mentioned two interesting points here, which is why don't we bind the existing regulatory regimes? Absolutely. Let's not talk about inflicting pain because new liberalization here or there. No, just bind what you have. Because as you know very well, and I heard you saying this on previous occasions, that the process of autonomous liberalization of services has been advancing.
Yes, for sure.
Out of enlightened self-interest. Sure. Always. So why don't we just bind what is there? And then why don't we focus on the digital side and think about the link with the JSI on e-commerce, which is now flying at cruising altitude. They haven't thought about landing it yet, but at least it is ongoing. And then have some kind of longer-term conversation about regulatory disciplines. Now we've done the domestic regulation, but what we did in domestic regulation covers transparency and administrative procedures. But there are deeper layers in domestic regulation that relate to licensing requirements as opposed to licensing procedures. The substantive requirements. Are your fees too high? Do you have heavy licensing requirements in terms of employment, in terms of things that you apply on a non-discriminatory basis, but are prohibited in terms of allowing access? And things like qualification requirements,
Right.
It's important. So having that actually starting, give it a long-term perspective, but start the conversation because the world outside is not waiting for us. So you put all this together, and as you said, the post MC12 looks exciting.
It looks exciting in the services area, as long as WTO members are willing to put the attention and the time and effort into this, which is so important for economic growth and for the world trading system. So I'm hopeful that they will. I'm hopeful that we've mentioned a lot of areas that are really significant and that are ongoing, and that the one that we mentioned that is still neglected, that someone will champion that and move it forward. and that the WTO reform discussion will link the JSI and the electronic work program discussions together in a perhaps more significant way, rather than an adversarial way, and that we'll have a more positive and substantive and broader scope of the services component of the WTO's work in the future, which cuts across everything.
So. I certainly hope so, because the statement in paragraph 10, as you mentioned, is about highlighting the importance. I mean, ministers, this is terribly important. It's important because of its role in the economy. It's important for developing countries and LDCs. It's important for post-COVID recovery. And
exactly.
If we can take the energy coming out of that paragraph, translate it into practical steps, we might get somewhere.
We might. We will.
Sherry, it has been an absolute pleasure. Time flies when we're talking to you.
I can't believe it.
But I think we've come to the end of this wonderful conversation with you. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights. And as I said, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And
such a pleasure to talk with you, Hamid. And we will continue our conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.